Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Towards Comprehensive Planning, New York City in Conversation. I'm Spencer Williams, the Director of Advocacy here at MAS. New York City is at a critical moment of reflection. We are looking back on the factors, processes, and policies that continue to shape our city, and we are looking forward towards a more equitable city that addresses disparities, increases livability for all, and prepares us for a changing climate. At the same time, communities, builders, and government agencies are all experiencing friction and frustration with the current planning and land use processes. While our city's zoning regulates land use, bulk, and density, it does not fully represent planning and account for community needs, investments, and the strategies needed to enhance opportunity. Many New Yorkers are seeking a more coordinated and collaborative approach to planning in the city, while others are comfortable with the status quo or feel New York is simply too complex for a comprehensive plan. Those who can navigate the existing zoning process, exert influence, can sometimes have an outsized say in the future of the city. There is an important public debate going on now about how a city of our size, with so many varying needs, cultures, underlying vulnerabilities, can actually create a shared plan for its future. New York City Council Speaker Corey Johnson's proposal for a new comprehensive planning framework outlined in Intro 2186 and the accompanying report, Planning Together, a new comprehensive planning framework for New York, comes at the end of the de Blasio administration and presents an opportunity to chart a new course for planning in the next administration and for the future of the city. I would like to thank Speaker Johnson's office for giving an early presentation to the Municipal Art Society's Planning and Preservation Committees and for continuing to engage in community conversations about this proposal throughout the city. The legislation proposes reforms to the city's budget process, assessment of citywide needs through a new requirement to produce a conditions of the city report, and strategies to address underlying disparities through better tracking and coordinated policies, and strategies to encourage more buy-in in the future of neighborhoods through local scenario planning. While the details of this are vast, I encourage you to explore the specifics of this legislation and corresponding report. The debate around this legislation has supporters and critics throughout the city. We recognize that there are many perspectives and details that we will not be able to fit into today's program, and encourage you to join the conversation both in the chat and through engaging with your local council member. Today's conversation will help us frame how a comprehensive plan is different from the current framework for land use decisions in New York City, how communities can be brought into the process early and often, and how to bring these efforts to scale in a city and region as big and complex as New York. Ultimately, we hope to really wrestle with what's at stake for our city at this important moment, and the people who call it home, and to not miss an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about reforms that can help us prepare for an uncertain future. It is now my honor to introduce our panelists for this conversation. Tom Ngadi is Professor Emeritus of Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He was the founder and director of the Hunter College Center for Community Planning and Development. His recent books include Zoned Out, Race, Displacement, and City Planning in New York New York for Sale, Community Planning Confronts Global Real Estate, which also won the Davidoff Book Award. Welcome, Tom. Next, I'd like to welcome John McMillan, who's the planning director for TF Cornerstone, a major New York City real estate firm that specializes in large-scale public-private partnerships. John was previously the director for planning for Battery Park City, where he recently oversaw the development of most of Queens West and is currently opening a 1,200 unit apartment project at Hunters Point South, which includes 800 affordable units, low-income senior housing, a school, and a community center, and is taking a new Midtown office development, 175 Park Avenue, through the city's land use review process, ULURP. Welcome, John. And lastly on our panel, I'd like to welcome Barika Williams, who's the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, Incorporated, ANHD, which is a leading nonprofit focused on creating housing and economic justice for all New Yorkers. She previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Housing for the state of New York under Governor Andrew Cuomo, where she managed New York's major housing priorities, including $20 billion housing plan and expanding tenant protections statewide. I would also like to note that MAS is proud to be a partner with ANHD on the Thriving Communities Coalition and the Racial Impact Study Coalition, both of which are committed to reforming the city's land use policies. Welcome to you all.
Spencer, can I add a quick note to that?
Yes.
I actually did sell my soul to the dark forces of capitalism a while back, but I've spent the last couple of weeks reading Tom's books and carefully going over Barika's fantastic website because I'm trying to get my soul back. So I want to thank Tom and Barika for their help with that. And so consider me in rehab.
Welcome. So I think that's a great place to start. I think I want to start maybe with Tom and helping to frame how we got here, sort of what the history of New York's planning has brought and sort of how this moment doesn't necessarily mean that change isn't impossible. We've seen a lot of changes. I'm wondering if you could walk us through some of the changes that the city has seen in its approach to land use.
Yes, of course. New York City is known widely as the city to have the famous 19th century master plan, which was nothing more than a street grid to subdivide land in Manhattan. New York City is also very unique because it has several large infrastructure projects like the subway system, in addition to which you have the regional rail system. You have one of the largest water supply systems, and actually one of the best run in the country. But all of this was done piecemeal, and it was triggered by real estate growth. Growth in land values that led to expansion from Manhattan out to the 5 boroughs, the consolidation of the city of New York over a century ago. And at that time, when the city was formed, there was a debate going on. Should we have a master plan? Look what happened when we had a master planner giving us Central Park, Prospect Park, all these wonderful big projects. And instead, in my opinion, tragically, the city chose zoning because that was easiest for the real estate industry to deal with. You can always hire a zoning lawyer and deal with the regulations and get the permissions that are needed through a friendly city hall. But imagine, and this is my message to the next generation. Imagine if 100 years ago, when we had bicycles and horses on the street, and when we had pedestrian transportation as one of the major means of transportation around the city, the private automobile arrived. And imagine what would have happened if there had been a master plan. Instead, what happened is the streets were turned over to the private automobile. And imagine if somebody had said, let's think 100 years into the future. And the response, of course, from the investors would have been, that's silly. We don't care about 100 years. We want a good return in 10, 20 years. 30 years we'd be happy with. But 100 years, we can't even think that far. Well, climate change and the crisis of environmental contamination in New York City and many other cities is forcing us to deal with the long-term consequences, not only of development, but of maintenance of the existing infrastructure. So one of our biggest contributor to greenhouse gases is not the cars or the trucks, but the buildings. So imagine if we had a more sustainable building plan then that foresaw the enormous growth that would take place and sought to manage it. So that's an argument for comprehensive planning. And I want to I want to praise the city council for putting it on the agenda. It's long overdue, and I think it does respond to an interesting convergence, because there are a lot of neighborhoods who have been criticizing the use of zoning as the main means of planning, or the obscure, obtuse system of the capital budget, and have been calling for community-based planning. And I traced that to the civil rights movement, to the fights against urban renewal, to the creation of ULURP, which goes beyond the civil rights movement, but that's one of the important roots, and to the 1989 charter revision, which enshrined in the city charter the capacity of neighborhoods and communities to develop their own plans and get them officially recognized and approved. Section 197A of the city charter. With the Municipal Arts Society Planning Center, I recall that we did some very deep diving into the history of community planning in New York City, and we found over 100, from very tiny scale, 1 or 2 blocks, to entire neighborhoods and whole sections of the waterfront that came from the grassroots up. So that's the background. And so that's why I welcome that comprehensive planning is on the agenda now. I don't think the city planning's proposal goes far enough, because it doesn't. It's all top down. It doesn't really deal seriously with the need for bottom-up planning. And it's not just about the production of a product, a plan. I cut my teeth as an urban planner, by the way, doing master plans. And I'm not an advocate for that. But I do believe planning as a process is extremely important. And it has to be multi-scalar, on multiple scales: neighborhood level, community level, citywide, and regional level, which is a whole other topic that we can't get to today. But without regional planning, community and citywide planning is conducted in a void, somewhat of a void.
Yeah.
A lot can be done. So anyway, that's what I think is missing is the bottom-up part of it, and the serious engagement, and planning not just as producing a plan or a product or a series of plans, but a process that involves civic engagement of a diverse city with many communities, different ethnicities, multiple languages, this requires a much more elaborate, planned process, and one that also recognizes local democracy, not just the approval by the mayor's office of a plan.
I agree, but traditionally, a comprehensive plan has been a sort of strategic framework for growth, right? With a lot of community input. And I think one of the big challenges we have today is that a lot of communities do not want any growth. And I think they're very likely to use a comprehensive planning process to try and keep growth out of their communities. What I would like to see as a part of this process is for everyone to understand, what it costs to run this city, what we're spending on social services, what we're spending on affordable housing, what we want to do with affordable housing, what that's going to cost, where we're going to get the money, and does growth need to be a part of that formula? Then at least you're laying out a rationale for growth to communities. And if they still don't want it, then they need to realize that there may need to be trade-offs and sacrifices down the road. Now, one of the things that the Corey Johnson proposal does is sort of insert a new dimension to the planning process, which I would describe as sort of applying critical race theory to city planning, where we step back and take a look at our planning initiatives, both current and in the past, to see if there have been sort of unequal, unfair impacts of our planning initiatives, because we don't really have very good data on this stuff. And if so, then I think the emphasis of the comprehensive plan becomes, corrective. It's redressing these past injustices. Right. And so then the question is, is that the best investment? Then what is the return on that investment? Will we still, if we redirect our resources in that way, will we still be able to afford to provide the social services we want to provide? Will we still be competitive with Tokyo and London and Shanghai? And I was going to kind of put that question back to Tom and Barika, but there's a fascinating op-ed piece in the Times today by Edsel that sort of describes how we're leaving behind all these potential Einsteins in our lower income communities by not getting in there and finding them and nurturing them. And that's actually sort of causing a hit to our GDP because these people are not able to contribute to our economies.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, John, I would say it's the intent and design and structure was for them to not be able, was for folks in these communities to not be able to contribute to the economy and to not enter what is traditionally the mainstream, predominantly white, right, labor market and capital market, right? So this is we still are dealing with the legacies of disinvestment, government-sponsored intentional disinvestment in most of these neighborhoods, right? So many of us understand this as redlining of places where you couldn't buy a home, or right where certain communities were locked in or shut out. But we also have to recognize and appreciate that the ramifications of redlining extend beyond that to people who were not able to get a small business loan, right? We're not able to move forward entrepreneurship or found ways to do it despite the fact that the formal lending markets weren't letting them, right? I think some of John, your point on the development piece and a plan to guide development, I think is an interesting moment in that intersection of framing it around critical race theory. I think a lot of how we've been talking about this ties into what Spencer mentioned before, the racial impact study legislation that just passed just a month ago with the leadership of public advocate Jumaane Williams. And so how do we put a racial equity analysis and lens onto planning and development and recognize that there are very different intents behind why people are saying they don't want development. There are folks who are very comfortable with what they have now, with their status quo, with what they're able to access, with the resources they're able to get. And so they don't want anyone to touch what they feel is their protected bubble. And then there are communities that don't want development because what has been happening to them in a way that they feel is detrimental to their ability to sustain, to maintain a place, affordability, safety, right? To not be in a place where they are, as a community, as an individual family, but also as an entire community, being displaced out of spaces and places that they've had and been in and existed in for generations. So I also think it's interesting that we've got these two different dynamics happening that I think can manifest and show up in very similar ways.
And Baruch, I wanted to follow up just briefly on sort of one of the ways that community-based planning has happened in the city, and the sort of absence of a real commitment from the city, has been the city's CDCs, or community development corporations, that have been thinking about how to build housing in their neighborhoods, stabilize their communities, thinking about supportive services. I think I'm curious sort of what lessons from that sort of community-based autonomy do you have that could maybe be applied to the city so that more communities can be sort of self-directive and prioritizing their needs and how change happens?
Right. And it's a great question, Spencer. And So for folks who don't know, ANHD, part of our membership is the nonprofit Community Development Corporation's nonprofit affordable developers here in New York City. We work with more than 80 plus neighborhood-based organizations. And I think we see both before, we always knew, but we see even more clearly in this moment of COVID, that these are our community caretakers, both in terms of development and in terms of direct services. And they have consistently been filling the void that government has not been providing or serving, right? It is our members who are working to provide direct food to people and are hosting vaccination sites and everything in between in the midst of COVID. I think one of the places where we struggle and really run into a significant difference in how the city approaches development is that all of our learning and understanding appreciation is you really have to engage in conversations with these communities to figure out what they want, what they need, what type of housing, where are their gaps? Is the community that is not being served a senior population who wants to age out of other housing but doesn't have a place to go and wants to stay in their community? That means that impacts what you're developing and what you're designing for a community. But we've got to appreciate that without a planning process that identifies that consistently over time, right? That a developer who is moving on a time clock is going to have a lot of trouble operating with that. And that the city's tendency is to preference moving fast as opposed to moving more slowly and being responsive and inclusive of what communities want and community voices.
So I would like to cite what I think is a pretty good example of a planning process, which has received a lot of criticism, but it's the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning. I learned most about this from Tom's book, but it was a community initiated process. You know, they spent years and years trying to deal with problems that they perceived, mostly these undesirable uses along the waterfront. They created a 197A plan. They submitted it to city planning. City planning approved it. And then there was some back and forth. They wanted, you know, a public realm, new parks along the waterfront, and they wanted affordable housing. So then what happened, as I understand it, city planning took that plan and then had to increase the proposed densities for the housing development along the waterfront in order to pay for those parks and the affordable housing.
They didn't have to do that.
And that was the
They didn't have
disconnect.
to do that.
And it was a way, you know, that city planning found to kind of bring the, you know, the public realm and what the community was asking for as a part of the rezoning. And now, you know, we have kind of recent updates as of 2019, where we've gone back and looked at the actual results of the rezoning, and we were able to actually reverse displacement trends that were taking place before the zoning went into effect, and we're actually increasing the numbers of minorities in those communities.
Well, John,
That
I
been
can tell that
decreasing
to
before.
tell that to the Puerto Rican community that has virtually disappeared since the rezoning. And tell it to all the people who took part in that community planning process, who expected that the plan would be honored and not just followed up with a rezoning, because zoning is one tool, and that they wouldn't collapse the whole intention of that plan. I was in those planning meetings. Everybody said, we don't want luxury development on the waterfront. We want to maintain a balance between small industry and housing. We want new housing. We don't want to exclude new housing. And there were fights over exclusion based on race, and the community is racially divided. Hello, welcome to New York. And they came out with a compromise. The city ignored the compromise and went ahead with its zoning plan that responded to the developer interests of building on the waterfront. And that's what happened in Greenpoint. It was a failure to listen to the community. And not only that, they introduced mixed use zoning, which was a hoax. Because people wanted to maintain small industry and small businesses. But when land values went up, thanks to the luxury housing, it didn't work. The mixed use zoning just became more boutique businesses and less businesses that were serving the working class population of
I
women.
think
The,
this
the va-
conversation, sorry to
the
interrupt.
vast majority of the neighborhood was downzone and preserved per the request of the community. I think one of the problems is that there is a disconnect between these upzonings and the provisions of open space and schools and that sort of thing, which is something hopefully that a comprehensive plan will help to solve. When there is this actual growth in communities, we need to bring in the schools and the open space. The city kind of dropped the ball on acquiring some of the public open space along the waterfront, but that is happening now, I think, with Transmitter Park.
Well, I think this brings up an important point. I think, there was a report that came out a couple of years ago by Churches United for Fair Housing that looked and examined that rezoning and found very different things looking at different data. And so one of the things that Speaker Johnson's proposal and the conditions of the city report, and similarly with the racial impact study legislation from Public Advocate Williams, really tries to say, how do we get a shared picture of the city so that we can all look at the same thing and agree on what's happening? And I think that in the gap of not producing that kind of information regularly and really seeing a gap, we hear from communities that it's not being included in the environmental review process adequately. That when we study and talk about displacement, that we're missing a lot of nuance and we're missing a lot of reality of what's going on in communities. And so in the absence of that, and what we've seen in some of the neighborhood rezonings, I think, has been the city responding to advocates' call for new tools. And so the Coalition Against Tenant Harassment as an example, and calling for how do we deal with speculation and how do we see and name that it's happening. And so we can have all these community members coming up and showing up at hearings saying, this is happening, this is the way displacement is happening in my community, and there's not been a response. And so then organizers come and ask for this new tool to say, hey, people are using development tactics and harassment tactics to get me out of my unit. We need legal support. And so here are some of the things that have actually come out of the externalities of the rezoning fights that we've had across the city have been new tools for tenants and new tools for communities to sort of be able to be stable amidst that change. I think, what are the key points of data that I think help us tell this story of what's happening so that we can actually reckon with it and then track it as we move forward to be accountable to, let's eliminate a disparity, let's increase opportunity, let's not leave those Einsteins behind.
Yeah, and there's no better summary and explanation of this than Barika's website, I have to say. But I think that, I think this is something that we all recognize. Legislation is being proposed to improve on this. I think it's that first big step in Corey Johnson's proposal, but we have to get a handle on what's happening out there and understand it. We all recognize it as part of any comprehensive planning process.
Corey Johnson's proposal privileges the question of growth, so that the long-term plan is supposed to come up with 3 alternative growth strategies presented to the communities and open that for discussion. Hello, neighborhoods and communities don't necessarily think growth is the big issue. They, in fact, more, if you study the rezoning fights, displacement is the big issue. And particularly in communities of color, thanks to the long history of redlining, disinvestment, urban renewal, Negro removal. It's not growth. Growth is an issue, of course, but it's not the main issue or the only issue. So ask communities, let's see if we can develop alternative scenarios so that we can have a discussion within the community and within the city. And let it be an ongoing discussion, a dialogue, where people can really bring the material conditions to the fore that they are living with. They care about schools, they care about transportation, they care about sidewalks, they care about garbage, everything that makes up life in the city. So when you get the city planning department coming and saying, we're going to rezone, and then people say, we don't even understand zoning, and now we need a new school. Oh, well, we'll get somebody from the Department of Education. No, yes, get somebody from the education, but first have a discussion within the community and a study to look at the needs and talk about the needs and so forth. The bigger the vision of this plan, the bigger it's going to be a flop.
Yeah, but I think we also need to appreciate how these two things fit together, right? So I am a admitted data wonk and love data. And while, John, to your point, all of us on here agree of what some of the data needs are and what we need to be examining, I do think we need to recognize that this is decades of advocacy in the making for the city to even acknowledge collecting this data and publicizing it, right? So it has been a labor and effort with some folks kicking and screaming for us to get to the point of the city acknowledging that harassment is happening, that displacement is happening, that we should be publishing information on racial demographics, affordability levels, where new construction levels are, not just as look what the city plan did overall, but what those impacts are and how they manifest in individual neighborhoods. And I think, Tom, to your point, then what that shows up as in terms of what neighborhoods are looking for is that the more data and information we can have, and this isn't just data on like development or FAR, floor area ratio, things like that. It's also data on how much money has this community district gotten in the budgeting process in the past 40 some odd years, right? And how can we compare that to other neighborhoods and communities? Because part of what is happening is that communities are being held hostage for the resources that they have been denied for decades. And the leverage point is a rezoning, right? So if you haven't had your sidewalks attended to, if you have potholes all over your neighborhood, if you haven't had garbage pickup on a regular basis for ages, and then the city says, take this rezoning and we're finally going to give you the school, and hopefully actually they do. And now communities are savvy enough to say, no, I want the school construction authority at the table. So I make sure that this is happening because we know what you've done to other communities. But then the city is still in the driver's seat to say, well, take our proposal or you don't get any of it. And that just reinforces and continues the inequity and the disparity that we know has been in place between neighborhoods when it comes to the holistic view of planning for really since the beginning of New York City, I would say.
And with that, John, I'm curious, there's a question in the chat of sort of, does the private sector feel that infrastructure is keeping up with approved development? I would add to that, I think we ask a lot of development in New York City to pay for all of the things. One of our affordable housing production strategies is mandatory inclusionary housing. When we're looking for new schools, development can really play a big role in that. That's the moment when there's on the hook. I'm curious if you could talk about the sort of interaction between sort of community-based planning, budgeting, and the role of development through your experience in your LIC as sort of an example of a planning effort that was looking at what were some of the challenges and benefits for approaching an effort even on that smaller scale and what it might mean for a larger community process.
So your LIC was sort of the leftover Amazon site, and the city council came to us and asked us to work with the neighbors to the south and to the north to come up with a comprehensive plan for this section of the Long Island City waterfront. The community had been asking for a comprehensive plan for a long time. So we put this plan together. We had enormous efforts towards community outreach. We had a series of meetings with the community on a variety of topics like workforce training, open space, community services. But one of the frustrations that I always feel is I haven't figured out how to have a serious conversation with the community about the economics of these projects and density, right? And so in this case, the city was asking us not only to provide all the public amenities on the site, but to go off the site and spend approximately $700 million to include area infrastructure. And that was just, we came up with maybe $500 million. So the city pulled the plug on the whole project. But so there are clearly limits to how much sort of public realm, public infrastructure these private developments can take. The city pushed us, beyond the brink at your LIC. But I think, at Queens West, we were able to pay for the acquisition and open space. A lot of times you're able to pay for affordable housing, but it's difficult to do all that and then go off your site and also pay for infrastructure.
Can I add one thing on this, Spencer, which is, I think it also, because many of ANHG's members are developers as well. And I think one thing that we do need to understand and appreciate is how much, in multiple different ways and angles, government is shifting the responsibility, onus, and burden to other actors, whether it's nonprofits, for-profit developers, community-based advocacy. Some of this, they should be running and spearheading. It shouldn't necessarily be on us to do this work. And I think a case in point to the attendees' question around infrastructure is when we think about things like how we're going to green and think about climate justice and how that intersects with our built environment. So there have been conversations about things like shifting away from gas to predominantly electric heating and power consistently across the board as we think about how to reduce our city's carbon footprint, right? How we're thinking about sprinklers in many of our older buildings. But all of that relies on a certain level of infrastructure that happens on the street levels that the city is unwilling to do and unwilling to pay for, right? So if they are not able to carry the load, if there is not water hookups for everywhere, we're running into this clearly with broadband as well, then that is not really an option that should be put on any of these development entities. That is the responsibility of utilities in a certain manner, and that we should be tackling overall as a city plan, not asking people to do one by one, building by building.
Yeah, and there's no question communities do not want developers leading planning processes. They don't want developers providing these public infrastructure. They want their government to do that, but it comes back to the government being able to afford that.
And so for you all, I think the budget component of the speaker's proposal, I think, has gotten a lot less attention than some of the other aspects. Having a sort of 10-year capital strategy and a full list and accounting of sort of the needs of the city, and then some annual commitment to then fund from that priority list, to sort of have your needs represented independent of those conversations around changes to the zoning. Do you think that would be helpful in generating sort of more support for communities having trust that their investments are coming independent of whether or not they're being asked to grow?
I think it's part of what the Corey Johnson proposal is trying to deal with, that if we look at our communities and figure out where we have not invested, then we need to kind of go back and redress that situation and invest, where we haven't invested in the past. And that would become the emphasis of this comprehensive plan.
I think the other piece is understanding that budget inequity is one of the most cyclical, systemic ways that we continue to reinforce our disparities between communities. And I would encourage folks to look at TCC, the Thriving Communities Coalition that MAS and ANHG are both a part of, which is not just housing and planning groups, right? And I think that is what's so telling, is we all very much understand how collectively planning / the built environments budget inequity is manifesting and showing up in schools and in transit and in housing and in, right? And so it's the coalition of organizations that have come together are much broader topic wise, because we really appreciate that what is happening in our schools is shaping what is happening in our neighborhoods and vice versa. And that we need to, if we're tackling school segregation, then we may need to be tackling housing and vice versa, tied together.
And I will say, one of the sort of places where this comes up in terms of the disconnect between zoning and planning and budget, it shows up in the proposal from the speaker. The proposal does not task the Department of City Planning with doing this work. It is looking to tap the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability to do that work. And we certainly saw at the hearing for this legislation a lot of reticence and pushback on it's too expensive, we can't do that. How can the planning happen if one of the chief planning agencies in the city is so reticent to change? What needs to happen in terms of comprehensive planning to really make sure that our systems and our institutions and our agencies are actually going to be coming to the table with solutions
Well,
to do
the
this?
city planning department has resisted planning for most of its history. There were short periods during which it even undertook a little bit of comprehensive planning, but it's really focused on zoning. I testified at one of the charter revision hearings with the chair of the City Planning Commission, who stated outright that it was a waste of time and money, that comprehensive planning was a waste of time and money. And okay, well, if you start with that premise, you are not, how are you going to engage? It's still going to be all about the individual ULURP and getting ULURPs through and doing the environmental impact studies that most people don't have time to read, don't understand, and so forth. So I think it really does take, it takes leadership in a very top-down siloed government that has a strong mayor. But at this point, we haven't seen the humility of a mayor that says, I can't do it all. I don't know what the future holds for the whole city. Let's ask the citizens. Let's ask people. Let's ask the residents. And let's look at the problems everywhere and listen instead of going through the city planning department's routine public hearings where everybody gets 2-3 minutes to speak, then sits down, and you have no dialogue. You don't have any discussion. And with justifiably, a lot of communities and community boards saying, you're not listening to us. You're taking us through this. And so it's delegitimizing what tools the city already has available, but it's also preventing legitimate tools from arising. And they are arising from the grassroots. If you look at at communities that have actually gone ahead on their own, and that's where most of the community plans have come from. They were not supported by the city.
I think getting city planning buy-in is just a matter of the mayor telling them to do it, and we haven't had this particular
Well, if it takes
proposal came
the
from
mayor
the
to
city
tell them
council.
how to do it, then you already lost the
Well, I mean,
battle.
I think getting them to care about it is a matter of, of the mayor directing them to do it. Whether or not they can do it and have the capacity to do it is another matter. But enormous amounts of work goes into things like the East Midtown rezoning or Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and I think there are real limits as to how much of the city planning can think about planning at one time. It's
No,
just
the real estate industry has consistently argued against comprehensive planning. So that's why the mayors haven't done it. The people who got them into office.
I don't agree with that. I think real estate people just want to know what the rules are.
The last panel I was on was with Joe Rose, who was the head of the City Planning Commission, from a wealthy developer family.
Right.
And Joe and I had the same discussion. And the fact of the matter is he didn't support community planning, period.
I mean,
or citywide planning.
I think this is one place I'd have to differ with specific, like strongly differ with you, John, on whether or not a mayor could come in and direct city planning to take this on. I think our experience and our interactions time and time again reinforce that city planning seems not just to be reluctant, but seems to be out and outright unwilling and oppositional to doing anything that is shifting a framework. They are, to use a phrase that a friend of mine, Josh, who is a planner that came out of Hunter, framed it as, is they are the department of the status quo. They are uninterested in adjustment. They are uninterested in even recognizing their longstanding role in the inequities that we already have in place. And so I think for so many of us, it's a real struggle to think about how we engage in moving city planning to being a partner. That doesn't mean they agree with us all the time. We as organizations don't always agree all the time, but even being in a place where we can say, we can figure out how to move out of this absurd hole that we have been in, that we know is hurting people, that we know is displacing people. And city planning just seems to be across and this is not, there are great individual folks there, but as a agency, as a bureaucracy, just seems to be deeply, deeply entrenched in maintaining things as they are.
Well, then I suppose that's why the Corey Johnson proposal takes all of this out of city planning and puts it in the mayor's office. Maybe that's a smart thing.
And to Spencer, one of the folks asked the question, like, does this make sense to put this in the mayor's office? Why isn't this in DCP?
Yeah.
And I think the honest answer is, I'm not sure that that would be the ideal design. I'm not sure the ideal design is to put it in the mayor's office, but I do think it's an honest appreciation by advocates, planners, and politicians that putting it in DCP, to be blunt, means it will go nowhere.
And I want to follow that up with one of the criticisms or conversations that's happened around this legislation, and certainly for New York, is like, how do we adequately resource community-based planning? Like, what does that look like? What are the resources? I know, John, you've talked a little bit about wanting community boards and people that are engaging to know more about the development process. There's certainly area-based planning that's happening at the grassroots level. And certainly, you know, all kinds of things in between. And I'm curious for you, sort of what resources would you say are most critical to support community-based planning in support of comprehensive planning?
I really do think that the development community would love to be able to have these economic discussions with communities, but they're a tad complicated. It's not rocket science, but I think a little bit of sort of education on the part of the community would enable them to engage in these kinds of conversations. I don't know what that would be, you know, a few evening courses, maybe you hire a professional planner to work with the community board to help them understand this, but to educate the community about the economics of real estate development and what things cost would be of great benefit, not only to the development community, but to communities as well. I don't know the best way to do it.
I would take issue with that, because there are a lot of educated people in communities, and there are a lot of communities that are pretty sharp and understand, because they've organized and they've been involved in a host of different issues, not just on development or building. They're concerned about public safety. They're concerned about a whole host of things. And the problem is community boards are underfunded, understaffed, and they are sort of kicked around as being the prime example. City planning does this all the time. Oh, they're, you know, there are a lot of people who they don't understand. We got to teach them about development, and got to teach them about zoning. Well, it's time to learn. It's time to learn from communities, to listen to communities, and fund community boards. They're the punching bags, you know, of the developers and of City Hall. They can say, oh, see how dysfunctional, how NIMBYs they are, and all. Well, I've worked with community boards, and there are a lot of serious activist people. There are a lot of people who fight with each other. Hey, welcome to the world. And government has to engage, but it's going to have to fund them. The 1989 charter revision required the city to fund an urban planner for every one of the
So,
59
Tom,
community boards, and they haven't done it.
Tom, when you say fund them, you fund them to do what? To
To be
hire
the
staff?
plan- No, yeah, to be the planner for the community board.
I agree with that. I
So
agree.
that you can't expect everybody to read a 4,000-page environmental impact statement. And also, but they need a staff. I mean, the average community board is bigger than 99% of the municipalities in the state of New York in population. And they're complicated too. And they have diverse populations, and they have no governance structure, and very little. And you have volunteers who are appointees of political clubs, many of them, but there are many experienced activists and so forth who eventually give up because they're not getting support from government.
I mean, I would say it falls somewhere in between. I think there's, I mean, I echo John's sentiments that sometimes there are things and proposals and ideas that come from communities that don't necessarily reflect what can be accomplished on the ground, star caveat, with the current government structures, right? So we cannot right now build an 100% of a building at 20 or 30% AMI without changing the way that the city supports and subsidizes these projects. Now, should that be on the table? Should that be a conversation? Absolutely. But given the rules that they've set, I am in a place where what I have to go to and say to a community board is, if we did that right now, absent the city doing something different than what they have done in the future, the building would fall into the red in very short order, right? But I think Tom is also right in the sense of these communities we have learned from each other. We have been through this multiple times and multiple rounds. They are very savvy on what this process is and what this work is. And I will say, spoiler alert for a report that ANHD will be releasing next week around land use, which is that low income communities of color get more and leverage more from a private rezoning than almost every other combination or construct. They are figuring out how to have the conversations on a private rezoning of what the community needs and what they're looking for, and getting more affordability than any of the other combinations of what is being asked. And I think that that speaks to communities who have been like, we know what we need. We're going to start this conversation. You have to communicate with us. You have to talk to us and get to a better endpoint than what oftentimes is initiated by the city or in a larger rezoning.
All right, thank you all we're getting close to time. We could talk about, there are a number of topics that we haven't been able to touch or have only barely touched the surface of. There's a number of questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to fully. I would encourage those participating to email events@mas.org. Any questions that may be outstanding, and we will try to incorporate them in ways that we can in the future. But before I let you all go, I would like to give you an opportunity to sort of give the speaker some advice on how to move comprehensive planning forward, or the upcoming administration, not knowing who it will be until the vote, obviously. But yeah, the floor is yours to give New York City some advice on what the most critical things to do for comprehensive planning are. Maybe let's start with Tom.
Well, yeah, I think the first thing is to launch a broader discussion about planning, long-term planning for the city, and middle range and short-term planning as well. You know, people who weren't educated in planning schools don't break life down into these artificial categories. And so, I think there really needs to be a much wider discussion. And the city has to learn from City Hall on down through the line agencies how to have public discussions that are not just turn on the mic, you have 3 minutes, next person, you have 3 minutes. But how can we encourage dialogues? And I do think it has to result in institutional change. Yes, a comprehensive planning process and structure are necessary because we're facing sea level rise, climate change, a whole host of environmental and environmental justice issues. There may have to be retreats from the waterfront. How are you going to decide that? Is it only going to be those who are forced out that are going to be invited to choose their mode of transportation to wherever they're forced to go to? No, this is where looking long-term and midterm and short-term is the universal civic responsibility. We need a mayor and city council people and agency heads who are committed to that. Is that going to happen? Because I say it, no. But that's what I think needs to be done. If you're going to, otherwise it's just going to be another exercise in paperwork.
Well, clearly we can't get anything done these days. I mean, rezonings are sort of collapsing all over the city, and there is a huge disconnect between what the city is trying to do and the community's perception of that. And we have to figure out how to get buy-in from communities for whatever initiatives we undertake. And I don't know the best way to do that. I think the city has done a very bad job of articulating its goals and its rationales. But I also think that, that communities, I think that if we invested more in our community boards to kind of help them understand some of the city's goals and the economics and the sort of the challenges behind the problems that the city's attempting to solve, that somehow we could begin to close that gap. But that's the problem, is that the community is just not seeing these initiatives in the same way that the city is laying them out.
And then I would say, I think a number of people raised in the chat, and both Tom and John have mentioned engagement. And I think to get us to the point where we're not at the stalemate that we are currently at in terms of development, if not approaching, if not already there, and don't end up in a place where it just becomes another sheet of paper, to Tom's point, is really rooted in the step-by-step process and engagement, and whether or not we're going to transition from community engagement. And when I say community, I mean, in that context, it means everybody. But when I say our community, ANHD mainly works in low and moderate income, BIPOC, and immigrant neighborhoods, and in a way that dignifies and respects their experiences, what they see, and what they want, and actually incorporates those. If this process ends up being another iteration of intentionally or unintentionally silencing, marginalizing, and shutting out certain voices that are counterproductive or counter to maybe what certain interests or the city wants, then we're going to end up right back where we started. So I think the core question is, like, how can we not use this, use comprehensive planning to really shift the power dynamics and move the politics to where people take some risk and say, I'm going to take something for my neighborhood that is in the interest of the broader city goal, and here's what it fits into, because we believe as a city and as a community that this outcome matters. And we have to get to the point where we can have those conversations and discussions.
Well said.
Agreed. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. There's certainly a lot more that we could get into, I would encourage those folks in attendance to continue the conversations with your friends, your neighbors, your family, your local council members, to let them know that you're sort of tracking this conversation and want to make it better or share your concerns. It's not often that City Hall or City Council want to engage in a conversation around comprehensive planning or rethinking the way that we sort of make land use decisions in the city. Doesn't come around very often. And so it is an opportunity to participate and help shape it, but it requires all of us to engage in that conversation, even if that engagement comes with really sharp criticisms, concerns, and the need for additional resources, strategies, tools, other pieces of legislation to make it work for you and your community. So I would, again, encourage everyone to join that conversation if you're not already in it. But also like to thank our panelists, Brika, Tom, and John, for their candor this evening, their insights, their leadership, and also their experiences in the city to really help us frame what comprehensive planning's potential might be for the context of New York. I would also like to thank my colleagues at MAS, and in particular our programs team, our Menopause Fellow, and planning team for all of their work in pulling this event together and this event series together, as well as their ongoing research and advocacy for more coordinated and community-based planning in New York City. For those in the attendance, I hope that if you're not already a member of MAS, you will consider joining. Your membership dollars and donations help us to continue to provide programming like this and support our ongoing policy and advocacy work. We hope that you will stay tuned for upcoming MAS programs and tours. You can find out more about those by visiting our website at mas.org/events. We hope that you all have a great day. Go talk about planning with your friends, and we hope to see you next time.